So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's first speaker, Chris Jackson, a Senior Vice President with Ipsos's political polling team. Chris, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ellen. Greetings, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for our April edition of the Ipsos Inside Track webinar series, where we track and follow the latest and greatest public opinion data about how the American public is responding to the news of the day and the run-up to the 2024 elections. We have a lot to cover today. It's been a bit of a busy 2 months since we last spoke, so let's just dive right into it. But as always, please, if you have any questions, use that Q&A box in the GoToWebinar meeting system. You can do that at any time. And as Ellen said, this data will be available. It's all on our Ipsos website, and this presentation will be available to you in the next day or so. I'm going to start off the presentation, then I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Sarah Feldman, our senior data journalist, who will go through a number of the issues before I finish up talking about a lot of our political data. So let's see what we have on the table for us today. So, number of topics. First, we'll start off just talking about the issue landscape, what Americans are worried about, and then Sarah is actually going to take us through some new public opinion data about a number of those issues, from the economy to the war on woke to guns, other topics. And then I will, again, like I said, talk about some of the political data and a look ahead to the next presidential election, the 2024 presidential election. So the main issue, the issue landscape. This is from our Reuters Ipsos tracking poll. It is a monthly survey where we ask people what's the singular most important issue for you right now. And as has been true for really the last year and a half, the economy continues to be the most dominant issue, with about 1 in 5 Americans saying that that's their number one. That has come down actually slightly over the past few months. It was higher late last year when inflation was a little bit more acute. And while it's still dominant, it's not quite as dominant as it was before. Crime and corruption, we can see, is our number 2 issue. It is pretty regularly, crime and corruption is sort of higher on the scale, though I think this particular wave is bumped a little bit because it did come after a couple of mass shootings. And then we have a range of issues that are all basically tied at 7 or 8%, including healthcare, immigration, the environment, morality, which I think represents how it's a very cluttered landscape right now. There's a lot of issues that Americans are hearing about, that Americans are responding to, and I think that's going to be a characteristic of the next year and a half, in that it's going to be a very sort of noisy environment where there's not really a singular issue dominating, unless we see some major events, some major things happening, you know, like a recession potentially, you know, big changes in the economy, or other sort of one-off events like the pandemic. A note, though, just to sort of has a big picture view, Earth Day is coming up soon. This is our main issue tracking for the topic of the environment and climate over the past 10 years, from 2012 to 2013. And you can see the issue of the environment has been increasing in importance over the last decade with the American public, to the point that before the pandemic, it actually got up into the low teens of the number of Americans who said that that was their number one issue. That was, if you can recall, back then, around the time that there was a number of global protests and marches around fighting climate change. Of course, then the pandemic happened. The pandemic really drew most of the available oxygen on the American public. But then as the pandemic has receded, the environment has kind of come back to the same position of being sort of one of those third tier issues, one of those sort of tied, which really puts it in the same category as things like abortion or things like guns, access to guns, gun rights. So these are, you know, the kind of issues that may not necessarily dominate sort of the public, but can animate a key constituency who can actually change policy, can drive policy. So just an interesting pre-Earth Day stat for us. Now to go into a lot of the additional data we have on what's going on, let me pass it over to Sarah Feldman, who will start us off talking about some of our latest and greatest data on the economy. Sarah?
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, so today we're going to kick us off starting with the economy. It's the biggest worry on people's minds, as Chris mentioned. And when we look at the data, what we find is that people are still feeling pretty lukewarm about the economy and their place in it. Now, here we're looking at Ipsos tracking going back to 2002, and our consumer confidence index, when we look at the past year or so, has been remarkably stable. Confidence is below the historic average, but it remains much higher than it was during other points of time, like during the Great Recession. And what we can learn from comparing confidence during the Great Recession versus now is that job losses really tank consumer confidence far more than inflation, at least as far as we've seen. Now, during the Great Recession, confidence got to lows we haven't seen since, when unemployment rose. And throughout all the fluctuations, the consumer price index, represented by that teal line, has undergone since 2002. Only really in the past year or so, when inflation reached generationally high numbers, did CPI begin to drag on consumer confidence. And here it softens it, but it doesn't really tank it in the same way we saw back in 2008. Which is all to say that, historically, high inflation isn't good for how people feel about the economy, but it's just not as bad as high unemployment. And that's a space we'll definitely be watching in the months ahead, with the Fed predicting a mild recession in the back half of the year. Whether that recession impacts unemployment and how that goes on to affect consumer confidence will definitely be a space we pay attention to. Now, since the last time we talked, the country underwent a seemingly sudden and very dramatic banking crisis. And the long and short of it here, when it comes to public opinion, is that Americans really didn't panic when the country was undergoing a banking crisis, and many weren't even really fully checked into what was happening. So, there were lots of headlines about the Silicon Valley Bank implosion, but really only about half of Americans had heard a great deal or fair amount about this a week or so after the bank failed. And here we're looking at polling we did with Reuters the week after the Silicon Valley Bank failure. I do want to note that among higher income Americans, there was a little bit more awareness of the crisis. But even so, many Americans really weren't spooked by what was happening, which is a huge fear when it comes to a bank run. Very few people are doing things like withdrawing large amounts of cash or changing their banks or selling off stocks, equities, or other investments for cash. And despite many people not being tuned into the bank failure or taking protective measures with their own money, majorities of Americans did favor the action the government took in reaction to the bank failure. Majority supported guaranteeing deposits for individuals and businesses at a bank that fails. But that majority support for government action really depends on how you frame the question. It's always a little bit more complicated when you look closer. So looking deeper at these dynamics here, we see that majorities across the aisle favor guaranteeing individual deposits at a bank that fails. That's the number on the last side, and that's the partisan breakdown here. But when we phrase the question as a government bank bailout of U.S. financial institutions, that support drops across the board and starts to look a little bit more partisan, with Democrats favoring this measure far more than Republicans. And, that's perhaps because the quote-unquote team heading up the presidency, and by extension, the government in the minds of Americans, is a Democrat. So that kind of bleeds into attitudes here. Now, putting aside the banking crisis and the economy for a second, we're going to dive into some other issues on people's minds. And we're going to start with abortion. It's been in the news quite a bit over the past few weeks, and particularly last week with the conflicting court rulings we got on mifepristone, a drug used for medicated abortion. The Supreme Court is hearing an emergency application by the Biden administration to maintain the FDA approval of the drug, and we're expected to get some clarity on that ruling tomorrow. So certainly a topical issue in the news. In polling we did with Reuters on the topic last week, we found that most Americans oppose state-level efforts to restrict access to pills needed for medicated abortion. And decisive majorities of Democrats oppose this, and a bare majority of Republicans do as well. So the surface-level attitudes towards that Texas ruling that really kicked this all off, threatening to overturn FDA approval of mifepristone, is quite unpopular. But looking at some of the other details around medicated abortion and abortion pills, we see much more complicated opinions here. Americans are split on whether they support or oppose women obtaining abortion pills through the mail, with more Democrats supporting this and more Republicans opposing this. Though majorities, including Democrats and Republicans, support women obtaining abortion pills at a doctor's office or clinic. So, as we've talked about before in this series, American attitudes around abortion really exist in shades of gray. There are not a lot of absolutes here. I do think it's important to remember, though, that on the whole, most Americans support providing access to abortion. Now, this fight over abortion access really feeds into views on gender inequality writ large. Here we're looking at some polling our colleagues across the pond at Ipsos Mori did with the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's College. And we find that U.S. attitudes are really in line with the global average on views on gender inequality and whether that exists for women and men in the political, social, and economic arenas. Though in the U.S., opinion looks a little different when we consider how age and gender intersect, with men over 40 being less likely to feel that gender inequality exists between women and men, and women over 40 are the most likely to feel that there is gender inequality between women and men. Women and men under 40 fall somewhere in the middle on the spectrum, though most still feel like there is gender inequality here. I think it's important to remember, just expanding out this conversation a little bit, that these dynamics between abortion and gender inequality also impacts the reputation of organizations dragged into this fight. Politically fraught topics can bring reputational risk to organizations, and that point I think is really well illustrated by the CDC's experience during COVID. At the beginning of the pandemic, way back in March 2020, supermajorities of Americans trusted the CDC regardless of their primary news source. As the pandemic wore on, as the presidency changed hands, and as pandemic behaviors became a way of marking what political team someone was on grew more apparent, trust in the CDC fell alongside that. And I think that's just an important case study to keep in mind as we think through the news cycle on abortion, given that the FDA is at the center of this case on mifepristone. And the FDA, much like any organization, runs the risk of losing trust with some Americans. Attitudes around federal agencies in some regards do bring out this partisan opinion, and we actually just released a great white paper on this morning. So if you want more context on just some of the partisan dynamics that are already existent in opinions on federal agencies, I recommend checking that out. Now, to kind of ground our conversation again in the news cycle, a lot of these issues in many ways, shape, or form just boil down to one thing, and that's partisanship. This ongoing culture war gets played out across many different domains. And I think a really great example of this is this ongoing dialogue the country is having over the word woke. This is polling we did with USA Today back in March, where we investigated how Americans understand what that word means. Is it an insult? Is it a compliment? How are people reading that? And a plurality of Democrats really see woke as a compliment, while a majority of Republicans see it as an insult. And I do want to point out, it's not on the screen, but an important thing to keep in mind is that, a sizable minority to plurality of Americans don't know what to think about the word woke. So this is not a universal language by any means, but when this language is used by partisans, people interpret the same word completely differently. We're saying the same things, but speaking a different language. And, going back to the news cycle, that is really, I think, well represented by the recent politics surrounding the Tennessee expulsion of 2 lawmakers down in their state house. 2 Tennessee state lawmakers were expelled for protesting gun violence, and that I think really demonstrates the real implications on legislating that the culture wars have in our country today, and also how Americans can interpret the same thing very differently based on their political vantage point. Here we're looking at polling we did with USA Today following the expulsion of the 2 Tennessee state lawmakers. And on the top line level, it seems that Americans are really split on whether the expulsion was an anti-democratic abuse of power or an appropriate way to discipline legislators. But looking beyond that, looking a little bit deeper into the crosstabs, we see different stories play out. Most Democrats see this as an anti-democratic abuse of power, while most Republicans don't. And to that end, I mean, the issue that really kicked off this series of events at the Tennessee State House started because of another hyper-partisan issue, and that's guns and gun violence. Here we're looking at polling we did with the Washington Post, where we surveyed gun owners. And we looked in particular at AR-15 gun owners, and we found that partisanship is very apparent in this group of Americans. 44% of gun owners who own an AR-15 are Republican, identify as Republican, while only 9% are Democrats. And beyond that, nearly all AR-15 owners have at least a few friends who own an AR-15, and by nearly all, I really do mean nearly all here. This is 95%. It's a very high percentage when we think about public polling. Far fewer gun owners overall, though, can say the same thing. And what that tells me is that these issues are inherently partisan and then get reproduced and fortified through the partisan circles that we move through in this country. And I think what that means is that the sense of alienation is produced, and people look out into the news, they look out into the TV they're watching, and they might not recognize their own communities or friend groups or families in there. And that's one of the effects of the culture war. And I think something that really illustrates this well is the comments Marjorie Taylor Greene, a congresswoman from Georgia, made on Twitter earlier this year, suggesting that the country undergo a national divorce. Now, we investigated opinion here with Axios and our Two Americas Index, and we found that, most Americans don't support a national divorce. Though at the same time, most Americans also aren't optimistic about the state of American democracy. And while that support for a national divorce is low, I do want to linger on that number for a second. 1 in 5 Americans supporting a national divorce is actually quite a lot when you think about it. It represents millions of people when we extrapolate that out to the population. And I think what that language of divorce and the support for it is really getting at is this supreme expression of frustration with the state of affairs in the US today. And that sense of frustration really didn't come out of nowhere. It wasn't born yesterday. It's been building for decades. And in that same poll we ran with Axios, we looked at views on the legacy of the Iraq War. It was the 20th anniversary was a few weeks ago, late in March, and we wanted to understand how Americans are understanding what is now kind of this historical point in time. And we see that most Americans are pretty frustrated with how the government acted here. Most don't think the Iraq War made America safer, and most disagree that the US was right to invade Iraq in 2003. And while that is all true, most Americans also still feel the US should continue to be a global leader on the world stage. I think what we're seeing here in the numbers is just a sense of frustration with how the government is operating, both here and now and also in recent history. And, what better way of expressing frustration in this country than through elections? So with that, I'll kick it over to Chris, who will walk us through our 2024 updates.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. So let's dive into some of our political polling, political variables. And as those of you who have joined us in the past know, we always like to center our discussion of politics in America around the measure that we think is the best sort of diagnosis for how people feel about the political system, and that is the president's approval rating. Currently, President Joe Biden's approval rating. The president is in many ways sort of an avatar for how Americans feel about the political system. And what we see is that Biden's approval rating has remained relatively tepid in the United States, currently at 39% in polling that was released yesterday with Reuters. This is our core political tracker that we've been actually tracking since 2012, though with Biden since he assumed office. And you can see that Biden's approval rating has been pretty flat over the last year, really since the sort of the inflationary surge happened and the early promise of the COVID vaccine to end the pandemic ended up not playing out, and the Delta strain sort of maintaining the pandemic. We've seen Biden's approval rating sort of drop and then stay at this sort of 40% threshold, with a little bit of up and down in that time. But again, like Sarah was outlining on a lot of these issues, this top line stability does hide a little bit of divergence happening in specific populations. And what happens if you look at this bipartisanship, for instance, we see that 80% of Democrats approve of Biden, and pretty consistently in the 80% range, sometimes a little more, sometimes a little bit less, while 90% of Republicans disapprove of Biden. So we have these two populations that have almost diametrically opposed viewpoints. And then essentially this movement that we're seeing in the month-to-month tracking is a function of independents sort of shifting a little bit from, maybe 50-50 on Biden to 60-40 one way or the other. But the Democrats and the Republicans have been pretty fixed in their position really since since about 6 months into his presidency when his numbers started to dip. And what this means sort of big picture is that Biden is not necessarily in a super secure position for his reelection campaign if he chooses to run again, which he has not officially announced yet, though most people assume he will. What we know from doing research around the world is that an incumbent president at 40% has about a 50-50 chance of winning reelection. So it's not, he's not certainly going to lose, but he's also not certainly going to win. While in comparison, an incumbent president with like a 50% approval has something like a 95% chance of winning re-election. So, that's almost a sure thing for a more popular president. So that is sort of the background, the climate, the environment for Biden and for the election that's coming next year, the 2024 presidential election, is that sort of low-ish, though not super low, approval rating, making it very much a toss-up, very much likely to be a very competitive election. And we actually see that across a number of different indicators. So if we look at the issue landscape, like we started off this webinar talking about, the main issue right now is the economy, but then there's a number of social issues that sort of could be put into sort of the culture war topic area that Sarah just outlined. And the issue landscape advantages one party or the other depending on what we're talking about. On the economy, Republicans have the advantage. So all things equal, that should set Republicans up to do well in any elections that are happening, any elections that are coming up. If this situation maintains that the economy continues to be the number one issue and Republicans continue to have an advantage, they should be on very good ground for the presidential election. But it's important to remember that the issue landscape can actually be different for subgroups, subpopulations, and that's where things like these culture war issues have become more salient. And indeed, we saw that happen in the last midterm election, where even though the economy was sort of not great, the economy advantaged the Republicans, the actual focus of the election, the focus of the debate was on a lot of these culture war issues. And on those issues, we actually see Democrats are more favored across sort of a range of topics: education, healthcare, the environment, women's rights. So it really does, I think, make it a little bit of a murky situation. If the news coverage and the debate was just about the economy, the Republicans should be solid, but there's a lot of reasons and a lot of forces that are pushing focus on these culture war issues. And in that situation, Democrats are actually slightly better off, have slightly better terrain underneath them, which again makes the upcoming election much murkier, much harder to call, much more likely to be something close at this time. And speaking of one of those issues, abortion is actually a good case study, right? Abortion is a topic that has been very top of mind in this country for the last almost year, since the Dobbs decision came out last summer, with the rulings recently on the medicated abortion drug that Sarah was just outlining. It has resurfaced as a major issue. The Supreme Court is likely to hear those cases sometime in the near future. But this is one of those topics that, even though it's actually been conservative justices and Republican-dominated states who've been passing laws about limiting abortion, it's not necessarily an issue for the Republicans, a winning issue for the Republicans. It's not an issue that helps them win a majority. Indeed, we see that on this question about limiting access to abortion that we fielded with Reuters just a week and a half ago, we see that the majority of Americans, 56%, say that they are less likely to vote for a politician who supports limiting abortion. Overwhelming number of Democrats, 77%, but even among Republicans, they're split, essentially equal numbers for and against, which I think sort of shows sort of why abortion is not necessarily the big winning issue in general elections for Republicans. But a key caveat is if you were to then take that Republican number and slice it even more into Republicans who are primary voters, Republicans that are taking part in primary elections, you would see that actually that disagree number is a majority of Republican primary voters. So Republicans are in this sort of situation where an optimal primary strategy is to be against abortion, for increased abortion restrictions, for outlawing it altogether. But as a general election strategy, that's kind of a loser. And we're actually seeing that play out in a number of places. We saw that play out in the Kansas referendum last year, where abortion won as a topic. We saw that in the Michigan midterms. And then we recently saw that in this Wisconsin special Supreme Court election, where the pro-abortion Democratic, they're non-partisan campaigns, but was a Democratic aligned candidate, won by a pretty substantial margin, because Republicans are having to navigate this sort of conflicting incentive structure where they need to run against abortion in the primary, but that's not necessarily a winner in the general election for them. Another thing that has happened in the last couple of weeks, is that Donald Trump got indicted for distributing money and hush money payments in the 2016 election, though the actual indictment is about improper filing of business records. It's very sort of Al Capone's tax returns-esque. But how is that affecting the former president? Well, it's interesting, because this is, again, a place where we're seeing actually sort of a pulling apart of the American public. So on the question of should Trump have been charged with a crime, we see that among all Americans, it's about half, 50%, saying that yes, from a relatively recent ABC News poll that we did earlier this month. But again, huge partisan differences. Democrats, almost all, very few Republicans, a slight majority of independents, saying that he should have been charged with a crime. But when we ask a similar question, do people think that Trump did something illegal? Again, just over half of Americans, 53%, saying yes, with that same very partisan breakdown sort of driving it. But it's interesting, because as that has happened, right, and as we've seen independents specifically kind of moving away from the president, thinking that, yeah, maybe he should have been charged with a crime, maybe he, did intentionally do something illegal, we are seeing actually Republicans moving towards the former president. So this is from our Reuters tracking. We have 3 waves of research where we're asking the Republican primary, and we can see that over the time period from pre the indictment to post the indictment, Donald Trump's position in the Republican Party with the Republican primary electorate has gotten stronger. He has gotten from a relatively small lead over DeSantis of 14 percentage points in early March to a pretty commanding lead right now over DeSantis, his next closest challenger, of 37 percentage points. And this is, I think, probably driven by a couple of different factors. One, Trump is getting a lot of attention from the indictment, and it's a very sort of triggers that sort of rally around the flag effect among Republicans. There's sort of the us against them mentality that has helped Trump in this instance. I think there's other forces, though, at play as well. Ron DeSantis, for instance, has sponsored and pushed through some pretty draconian abortion restrictions in Florida that that we actually can show has actually hurt his position with Republican women more than it has with Republican men over the last month and a half. Indeed, Sarah and our colleague Mallory Newell have an op-ed on that that'll be coming out in the next few days. Tracing that data, but there's sort of, again, a couple of factors happening, but the end result is that even as independents are moving away from Trump, even as Democrats continue to be very hostile to Trump, Republicans are coming back to him. So we're having, again, that splitting apart of the American public where Republicans are kind of moving one way, independents and Democrats are kind of moving another way. So that adds yet another wrinkle into how we understand what is going to be happening in the 2014 election. And then finally, we can just have some very, very, very early horse race polling. And I think anyone should be cautioned about relying too strongly on early horse race polling. Not that that stops us from doing it, of course. But what this tells us right now is that it is a very competitive election. So Biden versus DeSantis, Biden versus Trump. This was research that was done in mid-March, just after the indictment came out. Are basically ties, are basically are draws at this moment in time. I think, with early polling, anything within a 5 percentage point difference really should be viewed as pretty close to a tie. So even though Biden does a little bit better than against Trump in this and about the same as DeSantis in this, I would counsel everyone to sort of view those as dead heats. Against Nikki Haley, the former South Carolina governor, the former UN ambassador, Biden does a little bit better. That's, I think, as much attributable to name recognition as anything else. And then if it was a three-way race where Trump runs as an independent and DeSantis is the Republican candidate, you do see Biden does a little bit better, has a substantial advantage. And I think that does speak to probably some reality of if there is a candidate who split sort of the Republican base that helps the Democrats. Of course, there's counterexamples. If, for instance, a more sort of moderate candidate were to run, that would hurt Biden's performance. And indeed, we actually had some polling earlier this year where we had Liz Cheney as that third option, and that hurt Biden, put Trump, who was our Republican in that scenario, in a clear lead. So really, I think taking all of these pictures, all of these pieces of data together, what we're looking at right now, and again, it is early, it's a year and a half before the actual election, is it is likely to be a very competitive election, a very close election, one that is going to really sort of come down to a lot of probably, individual states that may have pretty close, pretty tight races, like we saw in 2016, where Trump essentially won by about 70,000, 60,000 votes across 3 states, like we saw in 2020, where Biden won by about 70 or 80,000 votes, again, across 3 or 4 states as well. So it's going to be, even though, there's these really large forces at play, even though both of these figures, Biden and Trump, are somewhat unpopular in the American public, we're likely in for a very roller coastery ride and close election in the next year. So that's what we have today. If you do have any questions, please use that Q&A function. I think we have some time to respond to them. Also, the next webinar is going to be held June 21st, so we will have some more data then for you to join us to sort of go through it. We'll be continuing to track a lot of these things, seeing how they develop. But yeah, if anyone has any questions, please go ahead and toss them in. I see a few already, so let me just pull those questions out. Can you talk about the different magnitude of the 2024 issue slide? Dem issues seem much stronger. Yeah, so let's go back to that one. So I think it is, and part of that is we've truncated the set of issues on this one a little bit. But yeah, we do see that on essentially a lot of the social issues, the culture war issues, Democrats are in do have sort of an advantaged position. And I think that's a testament to essentially how the nation as a whole has actually become somewhat more socially liberal over the last 2 decades. I mean, just think back, I cut my teeth working in politics when gay marriage was a winning issue for Republicans, right? And if you can remember that far back in the 2004 presidential election, there was a lot of anti-gay marriage initiatives on state ballots that most observers believe helped George W. Bush win that election. So, not even 20 years ago, running against gay marriage was a winning issue for Republicans, but since then, the center of balance, the center of gravity has dramatically shifted in the United States. Now, any candidate who runs against gay marriage would be kind of laughed out of the race because it has just become a very accepted, very normal thing. And instead, you have, for instance, Republicans running against transgender issues, these sort of, increasingly sort of, LGBTQ, transgender focused topics. And I think that's, again, a testament to sort of how the landscape of the country has shifted over time. Abortion, though, is an interesting issue because it's sort of one thing that has kind of resisted that movement. Abortion has continued to be sort of an issue where the American public is split. And as Sarah sort of referenced, the truth is on abortion that most Americans' attitudes are kind of gray. They're not actually a lot of Americans who have extremely hard, extremely crystallized views. Indeed, it's probably only about 20% of Americans who are for abortion in any circumstance at any time for any reason, and then probably 10 or 15% who are hardcore against abortion, no abortion under any circumstance at any time. And then the majority of Americans are in between somewhere, right? And that's part of what's happened to the Republicans over the last year is they've crystallized the issue in a way that doesn't necessarily work well for them. Because, again, most Americans are gray, but if you make it clear it's illegal, you're sort of pushing the public back the other direction. And I think that is one of the big questions to look at over the next year and a half is what issues become sort of the dominant topics of the debate, right? The dominant things that Americans are talking about. Immigration is actually an issue that Republicans are a little bit stronger on. It's not on the slide here, but it is one where they typically have a small, 2, 3, 4 percentage point advantage on that one. And you see Republicans do push that a lot, sometimes in maybe slightly crazy ways, like, we're going to bomb Mexico to stop immigrants from coming over, like the former president said recently. But then there's social issues which do tend to favor Democrats. And that's actually, again, that sort of interesting competing incentive structure for Republicans where to win in Republican primaries, they need to be very hard against a lot of these social issues, but then to win in the general election, it doesn't work as well for them. So that's one of the topics to sort of watch for Republican candidates. And that honestly was one of Trump's sort of like special powers is like, you couldn't really ever pin him down on a policy position. He sort of he believed everything and nothing at the same time, and his ability to sort of gin up outrage moved focus beyond sort of the idea of policy issues. So again, sort of remains to be seen sort of what's the dominant thing. Let's see, next question. Why don't you break down the election polling by electoral college? The national popular vote is not particularly meaningful. Well, we do, and we will later in the cycle. I think the reason we don't get into the state level polling at this particular moment in time is, as much error as there is in the national polls, there's more error in the state polls. So looking at state polling this early, honestly, is, it's going to be an exercise in a lot of, well, that's too close to call, that's too close to call, that's too close to call. So, I can tell you the swing states are going to be much the same swing states that we saw in 2024, but the precision of public polls is such that we can't necessarily say a year and a half out with any real degree of certainty what those close elections are going to look like. So it's just not necessarily worth spending a lot of time at this point getting into, though. Again, next year, as we're getting closer to the election, we will definitely be spending more time looking at the state level polling. Other questions? All right, well, those are all the questions we have. So thank you for joining us. I'll pass back to Ellen to finish off the call. Thank you, everyone.
Oh, wow. Chris and Sarah, thank you so much for today's deep dive and really interesting presentation. I want to thank everyone for joining us. And if you do have any other questions, it's never too late to be in touch and contact us directly. In the meantime, be on the lookout for a link to today's recorded presentation, and we expect that to be within the next couple of days. That now concludes today's Ipsos webinar. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Bye,
Thanks
Chris.
all.